My name is Jackie Zevenbergen with the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. I would like to present Where Would We Be Without Pollinators in honor of the 2020 National Association of Conservation Districts Stewardship Week. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the importance of pollination, who are the pollinators, and how they are threatened. We can thank pollinators for 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink, everything from coffee and chocolate to most fruits and vegetables in our diet. Pollination is also critical for many of the animal products we consume, including dairy products, beef, pork, and poultry. These animals consume insect-pollinated legumes such as alfalfa and clover at some time during their growth. When we start to think about what we ate yesterday for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we start to understand the importance of pollinators in our own diets. The foods we eat, the importance of bees and other pollinators for food and agriculture is well established. They provide an ecosystem service that enables us to have plants and animals that produce fruits and seed. 35% of the global agricultural land supporting the production of 87 of the leading food crops worldwide are affected by pollinators. They also affect the crops that are valued at over $24 billion just in the U.S. The annual income from pollinated crops in the U.S. is quite astounding, over $12.1 billion per year, and that does not include other crops like citrus, cranberries, blueberries, etc. Both canola and soybeans will self-pollinate, but production is improved by pollination by bees. Almonds are an interesting crop example. The California almond industry depends almost completely on the pollination services of migratory honeybee hives. An estimated 1.6 million hives are brought into almond orchards for pollination each spring when the almonds are in bloom. California's Central Valley produces almost 2/3 of the world's almond harvest, an estimated 2 billion pounds per year. Some plants, like this Virginia bluebell, can benefit from the pollination services of several different pollinators. Virginia bluebell flowers are pollinated by long-tongued bees primarily, including honeybees, bumblebees, antherphorid bees, mason bees, large-leaf cunning bees, and miner bees. These insects seek nectar and collect pollen. Other visitors of the flowers include hummingbirds, bee flies, butterflies, skippers, and sphinx moths, including hummingbird moths. This group of visitors seek nectar from the flowers. Small flower flies may also visit the flowers, however, they feed on the pollen and are not effective pollinators. This slide illustrates that pollinators are not only essential for plant reproduction, but their pollination work provides food for many other birds and mammals. Pollinators also make up a portion of the diet of a variety of other animals. Fruits and seeds derived from insect pollination are a major part of the diet of approximately 25% of all birds and of mammals ranging from voles to bears to humans. Pollinators are important in a grizzly bear's diet. This is due in part to the richness of their diet, which in Yellowstone consists mostly of white bark pine nuts, as well as roots, tubers, grasses, various rodents, emergent army cutworm moths, and scavenged carcasses. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from anthers to stigma. Most plants need pollen from a different plant of the same species for fertilization to take place. Pollination can be abiotic or biotic. Abiotic pollination involves a non-living agent to transfer pollen, such as wind or water. Biotic pollination involves a living being transferring pollen from flower to flower. Flowers can perform two functions, signal and reward. The signal, color, scent, pattern, lets the pollinator know that the flower has food. The reward for the pollinator can be nectar, pollen, or both. Pollen is produced in the slipper-like anthers of the male stamens. The female portion of the flower, the pistil, consists of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The pollen must be transferred from the anther to the stigma. The pollen grows from the stigma down the style into the ovule. Pollination is different from fertilization. Pollination is only the transfer of the pollen. Fertilization is the successful union of the male and female gametes. When fertilization of the ovule takes place, seeds and fruit can develop. Some flowers require cross-pollination for fertilization to take place. For example, a Cortland apple flower must be pollinated by a compatible apple cultivar, or even a compatible crabapple, that blooms at the same time, such as Empire. Some apples are able to self-pollinate, also called self-fruitful. Apples, pears, sweet cherries, and Japanese plums all require cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is not essential, but does improve the fruit set for apricots, European plums, prunes, tart cherries, peaches, and nectarines. Some plants, including many weeds, are able to self-pollinate if cross-pollination doesn't take place. Many animals serve important roles as pollinators. In some habitats, bats and other small mammals, birds, reptiles, and even larger mammals serve as pollinators. Hummingbirds, butterfly, chipmunks, and honeybees all serve as pollinators. Bees are the most important pollinators for three reasons. 1. They actively collect and transport pollen. Many bees will collect pollen and make a pollen ball, also called bee bread, with the pollen and sometimes nectar. For each pollen ball they make, the females will lay one egg on top of it. This provision will be nourishment for the larvae that they will eat until they pupate and become adults themselves. 2. Exhibit flower constancy. Flower constancy is when a bee forages for pollen, traveling from flower to flower of the same species. This ensures pollination of the flower. For instance, on one foraging trip, a bee will fly from apple blossom to apple blossom to apple blossom. They will not go from apple blossom to dandelion to clover to apple blossom. The next foraging trip, the same bee may go from clover to clover to clover, thus being selective for the same species of flower on each foraging trip. 3. Bees regularly forage in an area around the nest. This is great news for most farmers and gardeners. If nesting sites are provided to encourage native bees, or managed colonies of honeybees are kept near crops that need pollination services, bees will forage nearby and help to ensure that crop flowers are pollinated. Honeybees are an essential non-native pollinator insect. They live in colonies that contain tens of thousands of individual bees. Honeybees can tell time, distinguish flower shape and color, and communicate with their sisters, abilities that have evolved as a means of increasing honeybees' efficiency as flower foragers. Managed hives of the European honeybee can take credit for most crop pollination, but there is trouble in relying on a single pollinator. Honeybees face many problems, including mites, diseases, pesticides, and habitat loss. One important honeybee pest is the varroa mite, depicted in the photo. Just imagine a mite the size of a dinner plate on your back. These mites weaken bees and vector diseases. In the U.S., beekeepers have lost approximately 30% of their colonies every year since 2006, with total annual losses sometimes reaching as high as 42%. Due to pests and pesticides, the feral honeybee population, or wild hives, has declined by 70 to 100%. If you've ever seen a feral honeybee hive in your life? Have you seen one recently? Think about that. Most of the older generation will remember seeing a feral beehive in a hollowed tree, but very few recall seeing any feral hives recently. Many of you may have seen a bee swarm, but seeing a feral colony is much less common. I actually saw one of those a few years ago, but I haven't seen one since. Although we have fewer honeybees available due to colony collapse disorder and the decline in the number of beekeepers, we have an increased demand in the amount of acreage of crops that need pollination. Native bees also have value as pollinators. Many native bees are robust in size, such as the bumblebee or carpenter bee, and warm up more quickly in the early mornings and stay out later during cool evenings. Thus, these bees will spend significantly more time per day pollinating plants. Native bees keep honeybees moving. Honeybees tend to linger on flowers, but if they come in contact with a native bee, especially a bee larger than themselves, they will fly to another flower. Most of these native bees are solitary bees, unlike the social honeybee. North America has over 4,000 native species of bee. Recently, researchers have been studying the diversity and abundance of native bee species found in pollinator-dependent crops. Based on their results, they have found around between 50 and 100 species of native bee pollinators. Native bees are estimated to provide $3 billion in pollination services per year. Most people don't think of tomatoes needing pollinators, but with the help of native bees, plants produce significantly more fruit. Honeybees don't readily visit these flowers because the flowers don't provide nectar, and the pollen is buried in deep pores inside anthers that need to be shaken, buzz-pollinated, to be released. Bumblebees and several other native species will buzz or vibrate these flowers. The bee grabs the pollen-producing structure of the flower in her jaws and vibrates her wing musculature, causing vibrations that dislodge the pollen that would otherwise remain trapped in the flower's anthers. Some plants, including tomatoes, peppers, and cranberries, will not open to release the pollen unless a bee provides the vibration that is equivalent to the C note. A bumblebee can grab the tomato flower with its legs and vibrate its thoracic muscles, buzzing to the tone of C, thus opening up the flower and releasing the pollen. Wild bee species increase tomato production and respond differently to surrounding land use in Northern California. In sunflower hybrid seed production, pollen from a male row of sunflowers must be moved by bees to a female row. Individual honeybee workers specialize in foraging for either pollen or nectar. They are less efficient on hybrid crops like sunflowers, where there are separate rows of male and female plants. Native bees working the sunflower will bump into honeybees on these crops, causes the honeybees to change course and visit adjacent rows. This increases seed yield. If the native bees were not present, the honeybee would go from one flower to the next down the row of the same-sex flower. With native bees present, they will actually cross over to the other sex row, thus being more successful in pollination of the crop. Unfortunately, pollinators face many threats, including the loss of habitat, nesting and foraging in particular, the effect of pesticides, pests like mites and diseases, effects of climate change, and pressure from invasive plants. Many of our native bees are also in decline, including several bumblebee species. Of particular importance are members of the subgenus Bombus. This is a closely related group of sister species that range across the country. Once they accounted for some of the most common bees in their range, now they are nearly impossible to find, especially in agricultural areas. It is suspected that a bee pathogen has spread to wild populations from commercial rearing facilities. Bombus occidentalis is no longer available for commercial purchase since populations crashed. Bombus impatiens is now being shipped across the Rockies beyond its natural range. Bombus pennsylvanicus is also in decline, not one of the sister species, and several other Midwest bombus species are also in suspected decline. Note the rusty patch of hairs on the rusty patch bee's abdomen. This bee has disappeared from most of its historic range. Please keep an eye out for this bee. Without citizen monitors, we wouldn't have known that this species still occurs in Minnesota, Maine, and Pennsylvania. The basic knowledge of where a rare species presently occurs is a critical first piece of information necessary to conserve that species. From 1961 to 2006, the percentage of global cropland requiring bee pollination increased over 300%. It jumped from 18.2 in 1961 to 34.9 in 2006. To meet the anticipated increases in acreage of bee-pollinated crops over the next decade, America will need to add approximately another 500,000 honeybee hives. With an aging beekeeper population and declining profit margins, we need honeybees as well as native bees to meet the pollination demands. I hope you enjoyed this presentation today. If you would like to know the resources used to produce this information, I hope you will email me at jzevenbergen@cuyahogaswcd.org. Have a great day. Thank you for joining me for this presentation.